Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Tuesday, May 18th, 2021. We're excited to present the importance of a disability-inclusive workplace. Our goal at the Legal Aid Society of Palm Beach County is to provide high-quality civil legal advice, representation, and education to the disadvantaged of Palm Beach County in order to protect their personal safety, enhance their opportunities and living conditions, and promote self-sufficiency. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the chat or Q&A box, and we will attempt to respond to your question live during the webinar. If by any chance you miss on some important points, a recorded version of this webinar will be available. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our Community Economic Development Neighborhood Entrepreneurial Law Project staff attorney, DaVatrice Lindsey. Hi, DaVatrice.
Hello, Mario. Good afternoon, everyone. As Mario stated, my name is DaVatrice Lindsey, and I'm the attorney for the Neighborhood Entrepreneurial Law Project, known as NO. It launched in 2018 for individuals and small businesses. We provide residents of the Palm Beach County area the tools and knowledge to be successful in starting and or owning their small business. We also supply limited financial assistance for business registration, logo design, home occupation affidavit, and more for eligible applicants only. We assist with commercial matters such as notice for breach of covenant of quiet enjoyment, action for unlawful entry and detainer, wrongful eviction, breach of duty to deliver possession of premises, and lease amendment/modification. In addition, we assist with copyright registration and trademark registration. Lastly, we furnish webinars and podcasts regarding important business topics. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Robin Powell. Robin Powell joined Stetson University College of Law in August 2020 as a Bruce R. Jacob Visiting Assistant Professor, where she teaches disability law. As a disabled woman, Dr. Powell has dedicated her career to advancing the rights of people with disabilities. Before coming to Stetson Law, Dr. Powell was a research associate at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University. For nearly 5 years, Dr. Powell served as an attorney advisor at the National Council of Disability, also known as the NCD, an independent federal agency that advises the President and Congress on matters concerning people with disabilities. Previously, she served as the Disability Rights Program Manager at the Equal Rights Center, Assistant Director for Policy and Advocacy at the Disability Policy Consortium, and staff attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services. While in law school, Dr. Powell interned with both the NCD and the Disability Law Center, the Massachusetts Protection and Advocacy Agency. Dr. Powell is one of the country's foremost authorities on the rights of parents with disabilities. She is the principal author of NCD's Rocking the Cradle, Ensuring the Rights of Parents with Disabilities and Their Children. Dr. Powell has written and presented extensively on the rights and needs and experiences of parents with disabilities and has been interviewed by various news outlets, including NPR, BBC, ABC News, The Daily Beast, and the Associated Press. In May 2016, Dr. Powell was invited as a speaker at the White House Forum on Civil Rights of Parents with Disabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Powell.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping someone's going to pull up my PowerPoint.
Yes, Dr. Powell, here we go. We're going to put it up on the screen so you can have it for everyone to see.
Thank you. So as you heard today, I'm going to be discussing the importance of a disability inclusive workplace, something that is near and dear to my heart as a woman with a disability and as an attorney. And if you can go to the next slide. So the plan for today is I want to briefly discuss sort of my story and my experiences as a person with a disability who has gone through the employment world for several years and held many jobs, as you've just heard. And then I want to just give some basic information on the employment experiences of people with disabilities more broadly, I then am going to turn to the legal framework, that is the laws that affect employment among people with disabilities. I want to then touch upon COVID-19 instead of the opportunities as well as challenges that it has raised around employment of people with disabilities. And then I want to focus extensively on how we can create a disability inclusive workplace and conclude with questions and answers. So at that, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I wanted to start, as I said, by talking about sort of my employment experiences as a disabled woman, because I think they mirror that of a lot of people with disabilities. As you heard, I've held a lot of positions, but what you didn't hear about is my life before becoming an attorney. And that's where I really started to experience the discrimination that occurs by employers when hiring and employing people with disabilities. So in my undergraduate studies, I got a Bachelor of Science in social work with a minor in psychology. And in college, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I did really well. I graduated with high honors. I completed 3 internships while in college. So all around, I was pretty good on paper. And that's what employers would say when they called me. So I graduated, I applied to jobs. They would call me and say, you know, you look fantastic. This interview is really just a formality. You have all the experience that we would require and more. You know, again, this is just a formality. And what they didn't know when they were telling me that is that I am a woman with a disability and I use a power wheelchair. And I went on over 30 job interviews. And these were all jobs that worked with people with disabilities. So they should have been even more open than your average employer. And yet, interview after interview, the story changed as soon as I rolled in my wheelchair. Some were visibly surprised. Some were maybe a little less explicit with their shock. Some said really ridiculous things to me. I had one person who told me that they could not hire me as a social worker because I wasn't able to empty the trash. And clearly emptying the trash is not an essential function of a social worker's job. And so, you know, time over time, I would get these both implicit and explicit messages that I just was not qualified to work as a social worker. And as I mentioned, it took over 30 job interviews to finally get hired. And I remembered when I was going for my interview for the job that ultimately hired me, I was actually told the person about my experiences. At that point, I was really frustrated. And she said to me, you know, it would be really pretty hypocritical if we did not hire a person with a disability. And I said, yes, that is very true. And I don't understand why the 29 employers before you didn't recognize that. So I tell you that because it was my first really eye-opening experience to what it was going to be like to be an employee with a disability. And it ended successfully after several months and 30 interviews. I was able to secure a great job. I loved my job. But that experience really has stuck with me all these years later. I mean, that was in 2003, and I'm telling the story in 2021. So that story has really, really motivated me in a lot of ways, and really propelled me on. And ultimately, you know, people would ask me, well, why didn't you sue? Why didn't you do something? And first of all, it's really hard to prove that you weren't hired because of, you know, your marginalized identity. How do you prove that? And second of all, I was way too busy trying to get a job to start bringing lawsuits. And so I didn't do anything other than sort of complain to myself. Now there's that were in my circle, but those experiences and a lot of other experiences just motivated me to ultimately go to law school. And as you heard, most of the jobs I've had since law school have involved disability law, whether it was litigating or doing policy work or now teaching. And I haven't had quite as many experiences like that since becoming an attorney. I'm not saying that they've been perfect, but I've been far more successful. And I think some of it is because of the field I work in now, and some of it is that I'm probably far more aware of my rights. And I think that that has really been helpful. But what I want to talk about briefly, though, is sort of what accommodations look like for someone like myself. So I want to say that reasonable accommodations should always be individualized to the person and their needs. But I have benefited tremendously from reasonable accommodations in the workplace. And I've also seen where reasonable accommodations can go really poorly. So things that I have benefited from over the years are things like an accessible desk that is just a higher desk with no drawers underneath, certain software equipment that has enabled me to use my computer. I've had access to administrative staff to help me do filing or to pick up things or just, get books off the shelf and bring them to my class when I teach. So things like that, all pretty simple stuff. And the other reasonable accommodation that I benefit tremendously from is whenever I travel for work, which of course doesn't happen now because of COVID, but I used to do quite a bit of traveling, and they always, my employers always paid for a personal care assistant to travel with me. Again, that was a reasonable accommodation. And again, I think that I will say that I am no longer that 22-year-old looking for a social work job, and I'm far more aware of my rights. But that is because I have a lot of privilege. And I think that the average person with a disability does not have those experiences. And the average employer simply does not know how to respond. And I want to just, before I move on, talk about one way in which it can go poorly. So one of my first jobs out of law school, I worked for an organization, and it was a multi-floor building. And when you got off of each floor, you had to do this lock to get into the floor. It was security. You had to get off the elevator. Then there was a door you had to open. You had to turn your key and open the door. And the door was way too heavy, and I couldn't do that. And I also couldn't use the key. And so I had requested that they install accessible doors on every floor so that I would be able to access all the floors. And, I made the request, and then I didn't really hear anything about it. And then on a Monday morning, I came in, and they were thrilled that they had installed all of these accessible doors. And so I, of course, proceeded. I was really excited also to look at what they had installed. And their version of an accessible door was, instead of having a key, now you had to punch in a code. I can't punch in a code, and I still can't pull the door open. So they spent over $10,000 installing these very inaccessible accessible doors. And of course, we had to go back to the drawing board, and they had to ultimately install electric door openers, which is what I knew from the beginning. But the problem was that they never actually engaged with me on it. They got my request, and then they proceeded without me. And it cost them a lot of money and a lot of time and just a lot of unnecessary efforts. So my reason for telling you this is it's really important that employers and employees engage with one another when trying to determine what the best and most appropriate reasonable accommodations are. And with that, I'm going to move on. So, I think when I talk about disability issues, I always start by saying, people want to know, why does this matter? Why do I care? And it's because disability affects everyone. There is at least 1 in 4 individuals, or 26% of the adult population in the United States, who have disabilities. That's 61 million adults in the US who live with a disability. And disability, as I said, it just affects everyone. Everyone knows someone with a disability. A lot of people have their own disabilities. So it's really important that we really understand how disability impacts all areas of life. And you can see from this diagram that the percentage of people with disabilities is actually highest in the South. So in the Florida area, they have a very high population of people with disabilities. Next slide. And I also want to emphasize what disability looks like. So when you think of a person with a disability, I'm sure you think of a person that looks like me, someone who uses a wheelchair. But as this graph shows, only 13.7% of adults with a disability have a mobility disability. And in fact, most disabilities are invisible. That is, they are mental health disabilities, they are cognitive or intellectual disabilities, they are hearing disabilities or vision disabilities. So when we're thinking about disability, we have to realize that disability typically is not a visible thing. Most disabilities are invisible. And I think that that's something that we all have to sort of work through and understand that just because you don't know that someone has a disability doesn't mean that they don't have a disability. And so really just understanding this and recognizing that disability does not look like, what you see on an accessible parking spot. It's not just a person in a wheelchair, and really trying to broaden our understanding of disability is really crucial. Next. And I also want to point out that disability affects certain communities even more. So we know that 2 in 5 adults that are age 65 or older have a disability. That is, older adults are more likely to have a disability. Disability is more prevalent among women. It's also more prevalent among Indigenous populations. So again, we have to remember that disability does intersect with other identities, and it's also more prevalent among certain marginalized communities. This graph shows the employment rate for people with disabilities, and it compares that to those without disabilities. And as you can see from this graphic, the employment rate of people with disabilities, so the bottom 2 bars, is abysmal. It typically hovers under 40%, and it's even lower for women than it is for men with disabilities. In contrast, you can see the differences, whereas the employment rate for people without disabilities is about 90% or a little lower, obviously higher for men than women because of gender inequality, but you can see that there are really big gaps in employment among people with disabilities. People with disabilities are just not employed at the same rates as their non-disabled peers. And a lot of this has to do with discrimination. There's also differences based on race and ethnicity that I want to point out. And again, we can see that people who are people of color, people who are Asian, Indigenous populations, Hispanic populations, all of those individuals with disabilities have significantly lower employment rates than both white people with disabilities and those without disabilities. So again, when we're thinking about disability, and I'll say this again later, people with disabilities are not a monolith. They come in all varieties. And so when we're thinking about disability employment, it's really crucial to also recognize how other identities may intersect to cause really distinct and unique types of oppression. And another graphic I just want to show is the differences in wages between people with and without disabilities. You can see from this graphic that those with disabilities make significantly less than their non-disabled peers, and this has only been exacerbated by COVID-19. This graph only goes up to 2016, but I can assure you that the disparities have not changed for the better. People with disabilities continue to not only be employed at lower rates, but also to receive far less wages than their non-disabled peers. So when we think about sort of what are the issues that people with disabilities face, I often will go to the EEOC website and see sort of what their most frequent issues are around disability discrimination. And this report comes from 2019. They haven't released their 2020 report as of yet, but we can see that the vast majority of cases involved either discharge, so someone being fired allegedly because of their disability, or denial of reasonable accommodations. Both of those are both 68% and 55% respectively. Obviously, these numbers do not add up to 100 because you can bring more than one allegation. But again, it's people with disabilities are being fired and alleging that it is because of their disability, or they're being denied reasonable accommodations. And that is a really common issue, which we're going to talk about further in a minute. So there are several laws that affect people with disabilities in the employment sector. And specifically, I'm going to talk about 4 major federal laws. The first is Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act. And this law really does relate specifically to federal agencies and what their obligations are around employing people with disabilities. The second is Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, and this applies to federal contractors that receive $10,000 or more annually from the federal government. So again, they have to comply with the laws of the Rehabilitation Act around non-discrimination, providing accommodations, and also there's some affirmative hiring requirements within that law. Section 504 of the Rehab Act applies to all recipients of federal funding. So if you receive federal funding, you have to comply with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And finally, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I of the ADA applies to private employers, and Title II applies to all state and local government entities. And today I'm going to focus primarily on the ADA, but I want to point out that all of these laws have essentially the same requirements. So when I mention the ADA, you should know that I'm also referring to the Rehabilitation Act, as well as both Title I and Title II of the ADA. So Title I of the ADA says basically that no employer can discriminate against a qualified individual, and that's an important term, on the basis of disability. And this applies to all areas of employment, whether it's job application procedures, hiring, promotions, discharge of employees, compensation, and terms, conditions, and privileges that relate to employment. So Title I applies to most employment scenarios. So who is a person with a disability? Because I told you that Title I applies and prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability when we're dealing with a qualified individual with a disability. So who is a person with a disability? There are three ways you can meet the definition of disability. The first and the most common is physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this is really, the person's actually disabled. So they have some sort of impairment that's substantially limiting some part of their life. So that's if someone's actually disabled. The second way you can meet the definition is by having a record of such an impairment. So this would be perhaps someone who is in remission from cancer. They previously would have qualified under the first prong, but now they're in remission. They no longer being substantially limited, but they're being discriminated because of that record. And then the third and final one is to be regarded as having such an impairment. So this could be someone who is being presumed to have a disability. Perhaps someone who has some injuries from being in a fire, they're a survivor, they have some burns, however, and they're being discriminated based on those disabilities, or the perceived disabilities rather. They don't actually have some sort of impairment that substantially limits them, but they're being perceived as having one. This is often an issue around people who have mental health disabilities, and they're being regarded as having such an impairment. So their mental health disabilities might not quite meet the first prong, and yet they're still being discriminated based on their disability or alleged disability. So then who's a qualified individual with a disability? It's someone who has a disability and that can satisfy the required skills, the experience, and education for the desired position held, as well as be able to perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodations. And those are really important. You have to be able to meet all of the job requirements, and you have to be able to perform the essential functions, but not everything is an essential function. And when you're thinking about what is an essential function, you really have to determine, is it really essential? I give you the example of, as I've told you, when I was applying for social work jobs, someone told me that they couldn't hire me because I could not empty the trash. And I am confident that a court would never find that being able to empty the trash was an essential function of a social work position. So really, what are the essential functions, and can they be done with or without a reasonable accommodation? There's another thing I want to mention, and that's associational discrimination. So Title I of the ADA prohibits discrimination in employment against associates of people with disabilities, and this typically is family members. So you might have a parent of a child with a disability, and you find out their child has a disability, and you start to have concerns, oh my goodness, are they going to have to miss a lot of work? How is this going to affect their employment now that they're a parent of a kid with a disability? And if you fire them or somehow have some sort of adverse employment action because of that association, that would be violating Title I of the ADA. So it's really important to recognize that that's another way in which discrimination can be protected under the ADA. It's also important to understand that the ADA covers people who are substance use, who use substances. So current users of illegal drugs are not protected under the ADA. However, the term current is not really defined by the regulations, and it's really jurisdictional. So courts have determined that current could be 3 weeks, it could be 6 months ago, it could be 8 months ago. It really varies court to court. And one of the things that folks in the disability law world particularly are also recognizing is that relapse is part of recovery. So really understanding that, what does current mean? And does it mean if they had one relapse that they're no longer protected? That's something that courts are really individuals with a record of this addiction to illegal drugs, however, as I mentioned, are protected if they're not current users. In other words, they're rehabilitated. Also, an alcoholic, whether active or not, is protected under the ADA. However, of course, an employer can discipline, discharge, or deny employment to someone who uses alcohol if their alcohol use is affecting their job performance or conduct. But you may need to provide reasonable accommodations based on their status as an alcoholic, for instance, allowing them to go out for lunch so that they can attend an AA meeting. That's a very common one. So who is covered or what is covered by Title I? It applies to private employers. As I mentioned, Title II applies to state and local governments. It applies to employment agencies, and it applies to labor unions. The ADA Title I does not apply to employers that have fewer than 15 workers. It also doesn't apply to the US government. It doesn't apply to Indian tribes. It doesn't apply to private membership clubs, and it does not apply to religious organizations. The ADA should be interpreted broadly. It should protect all phases of employment. That's things like hiring, as I said, advancing, terminating, compensating, benefits, even things like social activities. So if you have a holiday party, you need to make sure that it's being held in an accessible location. Title I applies to everything related to employment. From the moment you advertise your position, you have Title I obligations. So if you are using online applications, for instance, where individuals can apply for a job through their some website, you need to make sure it's accessible for people with disabilities, and or is there an alternative accessible option that people with disabilities can clearly identify and understand how to apply to the job. So there are a number of non-discrimination requirements. It's things like, limiting or segregating or classifying a person in a way that would adversely affect people with disabilities. It might be using, administrative criteria or procedures that may have the effect of discriminating against a person with a disability. It could be, you can't deny equal jobs or benefits to a person with a disability. Not providing reasonable accommodations is discrimination. Also using selection criteria or standards or tests that would screen out or might screen out people with disabilities, that is also discrimination. And also sort of how you select and administer employment tests. If those tests are really designed to identify a person's disability. So these are all things that employers have to understand. These are their non-discrimination requirements, things they cannot do. So what's a reasonable accommodation? It's any change an employer makes that would allow or enable a person who's a qualified individual with a disability to have an equal opportunity in the selection process, to perform essential functions of the job, to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. And what I want to point out, and I talked a little bit at the beginning, was when an employee requests a reasonable accommodation, it's supposed to, by law, trigger what they call an interactive process. So once an employee makes this request, the employer is then supposed to engage in what they call this interactive process, where they sit down together, they converse, they have some dialogue back and forth over what the most appropriate reasonable accommodation is. And courts will kick back cases if they see that there's been no interactive process. So it's really important. And as I told you in the door example, it can save you money as well. These are different examples of reasonable accommodations. It's things like providing or modifying equipment, making facilities accessible, providing readers or sign language interpreters, modifying exams or training materials. It can also be modifying work schedules and maybe even working from home, which I'm going to talk about a little more in a second. But these are things that really do qualify as reasonable accommodations. On the right side of the slide, I have things that are not reasonable accommodations. So you can't ask your employer to create a new position. You can't ask your employer to transfer you to a new supervisor because you don't like your supervisor. You can't ask your employer to reassign essential job functions. You can't say, I can't comply with the policies and procedures of my employer. That's a reasonable accommodation. That's not. And being violent or having abusive behaviors is not a reasonable accommodation. So those are things that are not reasonable accommodations, but I would focus more on what are reasonable accommodations. So there are three main things that employers can raise as justifications for discrimination and or denying a reasonable accommodation. It's things like job relatedness and business necessity. So, it's essential that this employee does this because it's related to the job and it's necessary for the business. The second one, and I'm going to talk more about in a moment, is undue hardship. We hear all the time, it's just too expensive to provide reasonable accommodations. It's going to create some sort of undue hardship. And the third one is health and safety. And they call this the direct threat defense. So if I provide you this reasonable accommodation, it is going to somehow affect the health and safety of you or others. Or, if I hire you and you have some sort of disease, that could be a direct threat to other employees. And that one is not raised as much. But undue hardship is raised a lot, and that's the one I'm going to talk most about. So an undue hardship occurs when an accommodation would require significant difficulty or expense to the employer, such as things like costs of the accommodation in relationship to the size of the business and its resources, alterations to employers' business or changes in how they provide services, some sort of disruption to other employees. These determinations should always be made on a case-by-case basis, looking at the specific employers and their resources as well as the employee's specific needs. Obviously, Google is going to have to prove undue hardship in ways that a small employee is not going to have to. So they're going to have higher obligations, whereas a small company that maybe only has 20 employees if I asked for a reasonable accommodation that was really costly, it could actually be an undue hardship. It could cause some sort of significant difficulty or expense. So again, what is the employer's resources? How big are they? Is this going to change the job? Is this going to cause a disruption? Those are all ways in which an employer could raise an undue hardship claim. And, I mentioned that undue hardship is a common thing, and I think it's also something that motivates people not to hire disabled people. There's this assumption that hiring disabled people is expensive. There's a study that came out, it's on the Ask Jan website. If you haven't been to it, I highly recommend it. It's the Job Accommodation Network, that's Jan. But they did a study of over 3,000 employers, and they found that 56% of the reasonable accommodations that employers provided cost absolutely nothing to implement. So they were things like modifying a work schedule. That would not cost anything. And the rest of the accommodations made had an average cost of only $500. So contrary to popular belief, most reasonable accommodations are not costly, and it's not very expensive to hire people with disabilities. And so I tell you these because I think that's something that we hear over and over again, and something that really does result in significant discrimination, when in fact it's not real. Most accommodations will not cost much. And I'm not saying that some don't cost a lot of money, but most will not cost much. So COVID-19 has really brought some new challenges as well as, I think, new opportunities. And I want to just briefly mention those. So COVID-19 is, first of all, going to result in more people with disabilities. There's going to be greater numbers of people with disabilities in the United States, particularly when we see what they call these long haulers, those that are experiencing extended symptoms after their virus has left their bodies, but they're continuing to have effects. So that's something we have to remember. We're going to have more employees than ever with disabilities. There's also things we have to consider around, are there increased health risks at workplaces that could limit employment opportunities for people with disabilities? So, is it, now that offices are reopening, is this going to adversely affect certain people with disabilities? Is they're going to increase their health risks? How do we accommodate that? That's something we need to continue to think about. Also, there's things around, if an employer requires vaccines, what does that mean for people with disabilities? First of all, we know that vaccines are not widely available to marginalized communities, including people with disabilities. There's also issues around mandates. Some disabilities, you might not be able to get a vaccine. And we know that even when there are vaccine mandates, there are exceptions for medical reasons or religious reasons. And we have to remember that may include people with disabilities in certain instances, very specific instances. But when those come up, we have to think about sort of how are we going to accommodate both the employee with the disability and the rest of the employees. Maybe that means that the employee can't come back to the office, or that they have to somehow be socially distanced in other ways. So just thinking about those. And I also want to point out something that I think is really exciting. We saw over the last 14 or so months this rapid shift to teleworking. And this has made so many opportunities that were previously unavailable, unviable, now available for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are able to participate in work at higher levels, in social opportunities. For years, people with disabilities were told that teleworking, working from home, was not reasonable. It could not be a reasonable accommodation. And now we see that everyone can work from home. And so I think that that is something we need to really embrace as we go back to quote unquote the new normal. How can we continue to engage people with disabilities? Maybe teleworking should continue for certain people. How do we really think about this? And, you know, I think that we can learn from the experiences of COVID, and this is one of those ways. So I want to end by talking about what is necessary for a disability inclusive workplace. So first, disability has to be part of all diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So when employers talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to make sure that disability is in the conversation. We also have to remember that people with disabilities are often members of other marginalized communities. That means they experience various types of oppression. So considering, you know, not only how does ableism affect them, but also racism, sexism, whatever the oppression is, how do these experiences uniquely affect certain people with disabilities? Remember that most disabilities are not visible. I pointed that out earlier. So don't assume someone doesn't have a disability if they tell you they do, because you can't see it. Most disabilities you can't see. Remember that disabled people should be recruited and hired for positions at all levels. So make an active effort to make sure that you're not just hiring people with disabilities for low-level positions, but that they can be CEOs, they can have managerial jobs. They should be hired at all levels, when we need to really focus on making sure that the workplace reflects society, and that includes ensuring that people with disabilities are recruited and hired at all levels, and make sure that you're actively recruiting people with disabilities. You should also, employers need to really make sure that they develop and implement policies and procedures that concern reasonable accommodations. It's really important that employers don't think about reasonable accommodations once they get the request, but really have a plan in place. How are they going to address reasonable accommodations? How are they going to respond to these requests? What are they going to do? What should an employee know if they want to make a request? Having these well-established policies and procedures benefit both the employee and the employer. Something I tell others is really important is bake accessibility and accommodations into everything you do. And to give you an example of what that means, I worked at for an employer a few years ago who was interviewing people for this position, and they had a potential employee that they knew had a disability, and they came to me to ask me what they needed to provide for reasonable accommodations for this employee. And yay, they were thinking about it, but how would I know? I don't even know the person. And they were really struggling with, well, how do I ask the person if they needed reasonable accommodations? And I said something that you would have thought I cured cancer. The way I came, the reaction was, I said, well, when you go to email them back to ask them to schedule an interview, you simply just include a sentence that says, if you need a reasonable accommodation, please let us know. And you include that in every single email you send to anyone who's scheduling an interview. So just baking it in, just having these conversations be part of the planning process really will make it flow easier. It will become more normal. So if you're thinking about a cake, you're going to mix it in. You're not going to put accommodations and accessibility on top of everything else. You're not going to layer it on. You're just going to make it part of everyday experiences. You want to also really, employers need to identify and they need to root out any sort of ableist policies, procedures, and behaviors that they might have in their workplace. Are there things that just don't make sense? You know, do you make employees go do these activities every year for, you know, building team building, where you do these, I don't even know what they're called, the fall exercises where you're supposed to fall on someone? Clearly that would not be accessible, and it's also not necessary. So really just look at what you do. How do you engage in everyday work, and are there ways in which they are adversely affecting people with disabilities? Also, really think about how can you sponsor disability-specific opportunities. I think employers should really consider how they could have internships for students with disabilities, as an example. Really try to make active efforts to hire people with disabilities, and that starts at internships. I had job opportunities because of internships I did. So really ensuring that you have opportunities just even at the internship level is important. And finally, The ADA should be the floor. That is the bare minimum. The requirements that I discussed earlier are the bare minimum things that employers should do, but they should also go above and beyond to really be inclusive. Don't just say, oh, well, I complied with the ADA, so I'm fine. Employers need to look beyond that. How can we really be inclusive? How can we really ensure that we are hiring and employing people that reflect our society, whether it is race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, etc.? How are we really being inclusive? And that requires going above and beyond just what the law requires. So again, the ADA should be the floor, not the ceiling. And I want to now thank you all for attending, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell, for enlightening us about such an important topic. There are a few questions. The first question is, what would you suggest to someone who has a disability who is seeking a job and having difficulty doing so?
So that's a good question, and it's a complicated question. So to give you sort of a variation on that, I often get asked by people with invisible disabilities, should I disclose my disability? And I think that's something that a lot of disabled people think about. And so what advice would I give? It's going to vary. Disclosure is a really individual and private issue. That's a big issue. So whether to disclose or not, you don't have to disclose your disability unless you're requesting a reasonable accommodation. So really think about what that would mean. Others like myself, I can't hide my disability. You'll see it. If you Google me, you'll know I'm disabled. So I don't have that luxury in some ways of being able to hide my disability. But also, what do I recommend? I recommend people get experience, whether it's internships, apprenticeships. Put yourself out there and realize that you're going to stumble along the way. And that's normal for all people, but you are going to encounter extra discrimination as a person with a disability. Also, be really aware of your rights. Ask for reasonable accommodations, even if it's during the interview process. But if I'm being real, you also have to recognize that we're not a truly inclusive society yet. So there are going to be employers that are just not inclusive. And, at the end of the day, do you really want to work for them? Probably not anyways. So again, my advice is sort of get out there, get experience, get the schooling, talk to other people with disabilities. That's something that you can do. I know people use social media a lot for that. Connect with others that have gone through the process. Connect with your vocational rehabilitation services who can provide training, and really just go for it. And you might have to go on 30 interviews, but you will find a job.
Thank you. The next question is, how can a parent facing having their children taken away from them due to having a disability find out what right they may have and how to fight for custody?
Oh, that's my favorite topic, and not at all related to inclusive work employees. But so I don't want to focus too much, but I think that, it depends. Is it the child welfare agency? Is it another parent? There are specific ADA requirements in these situations, and there's specific guidance out there from the Department of Justice. And so it's really, you're going to have to look at the individual circumstances. I'm happy to have conversation offline more about the specific cases, because it's really hard to give broad answers to that question. I get the question all the time. But people with disabilities are protected in these areas, parenting from the ADA, specifically Title II and Title III.
Thank you. And feel free, as Dr. Powell stated, to contact her. Her email address is up on the screen. And then we have one more question. What would you suggest to people who don't have a physical disability, who are being treated different in the workplace? So they have, I guess, a disability that you can't see, but they don't want to disclose their disability to their coworkers.
Yeah, so people with invisible disabilities, I said that a few minutes ago, they really struggle. And, I am all about disability pride. I am proud of my disability. I'm very out about my disability, but I also understand why people would be hesitant. There's a lot of stigma, particularly around invisible disabilities. There's a lot of assumptions that, oh, that person isn't really disabled. A great example of this that I give is when I was in law school, my first semester, there was an email that went around in my section where students were saying, you know, I just found out that students were getting accommodations, they were getting extra test taking time. And I said to them, you do realize that I'm one of those students that you're referring to? And they said to me, yeah, but you have a real disability. And so that's the issue that we have as a society. We don't believe that invisible disabilities are quote unquote real disabilities, and they are. So disclosure is such a personal issue, and you don't have to disclose unless you're requesting a reasonable accommodation. So as much as I, strongly believe that disability is not a bad thing and you shouldn't feel ashamed, it's also understandable that someone might not want to disclose. So as we're working to create a more disability inclusive workplace, I'm hoping that more people will be empowered to really identify as having a disability, but we're not quite there. So, think about sort of why do they want to disclose? Is there a reason? What are the ramifications? Obviously, we know that discrimination is illegal, but we also know that it occurs. So really just think through it. If you have a need for reasonable accommodation, though, you have to disclose your disability.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again, Dr. Powell. It's been such an honor. Thank you for everyone who attended the webinar today, and everyone stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you.